we now have the very last panel and very last actual official presentation for this conference this year. However, it's an incredibly exciting one. What we'll be talking about is sorry, my computer's actually just typically frozen right now. What are the chances of that?
We'll be talking.
Good. Yeah, just one of the pages I was on's gone. We'll be talking about patient communication and the interaction between pharmaceuticals and patients in particular. So the actual title is Key Patient-Focused Considerations to Operationalize a Successful EAP. So what we have here is a group of individuals from different backgrounds who can talk about how we can communicate successfully between departments and in and outside of pharma companies for a successful EAP. So I'd like to introduce Alexandra Hall, who you have yet to see on the screen as the Managing Director of the Isaac Foundation, and Naomi Litchfield, a Patient Advocacy Manager from Bionicle EMAS EAP, and Jeff and Christine, of course, you're both familiar with already. I've certainly talked enough, and I'm going to now leave the stage and pass over to you guys, but cannot tell you how excited I am to bring on this not last but very not least panel. Great. I am disappearing now.
Hi. Thank you, James. As I told James when we first started planning for this summit, this particular panel in a non-virtual world is always a kiss of death because everybody's grabbing their suitcase and heading to the airport right about now. But now that everyone's in their living room and dialing in, we're good to go. So I hope that this panel can do two things. One, I wanted to really highlight, as the title indicates, the patient considerations in EAP programs. We've talked a lot about sort of organizational ones and research goals and diversity and inclusion, which will include it a little bit in our panel too. But I want to focus on the patient considerations and how we can effect them better. And I also want to use this panel as the last panel to sort of wrap up some of the ideas that we've been talking about for 2 days now. So maybe we'll just do a real quick introduction. I'm not sure we have any new people that signed on. I have the payer perspective. I worked for a U.S. payer called Aetna, leading strategy, and then I worked in care management and pharmacy, and then I worked in a precision medicine oncology nonprofit. So each one of you, Christine, you want to really quickly, I know you introduced yourself about 3 times today, I'd say. I don't know if there's any new people or not. Should we just go ahead?
No, I'm gonna let Alex and Naomi go.
Okay. Do you want to do a quick intro, Alex? You're on mute.
Yeah.
Nope.
I muted myself just in case. Yeah, so I work for the Isaac Foundation, and I'm bringing the patient organization and the patient perspective. So the Isaac Foundation, we are a rare disease patient advocacy group based in Canada. But being in the rare world, we're quite connected in a global sense, and a lot of the people who have been speaking, and I think in this conference, we've connected with before, and it's nice to meet some new people as well. And so we primarily work in rare and ultra rare. So we focus on diseases like MPS, LALD, Batten diseases. And yeah, our organization, we do, patient education, support, fundraise for research. But the bulk of our work kind of ends up being around helping patients get access to medications, whether those are investigational treatments or, if they're drugs in the post-approval stage but are stalled because of reimbursement negotiations or things like that. So that's me.
Naomi, do you want to refresh us on your background?
Yeah, of course. I'm Naomi Litchfield. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, especially alongside Christine and Alex. It's an honour. So my background is paediatric clinical research nursing. I went into nursing because I lost a brother in rare disease, and my sister had 4 rare cancers. So they were my inspiration of going into nursing, and I spent a lot of time at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, where I had the privilege of caring for many patients and families with rare progressive conditions on clinical trials and early access programs. And I saw administering IEPs, the big impact that it had on those patients' lives. And then I worked for a rare pharma company and a rare patient group before joining Bionicle 3 years ago, patient advocacy. So we're a CRO and we specialise in early access programs. I conduct various internal and external patient-focused activities. I get to work very closely with amazing patient organisations, and I'm here really to keep our company focused on our mission, which is to change the lives of patients and families all around the world.
Excellent, excellent. So we do have a great panel, as you can see, and what my plan is today, we have 3 questions that we're going to have each of the 3 panelists provide their input on the 3 questions. But before we start, one of our thoughts was that we would allow a longer time than usual for audience participation because we're wrapping up, and I have a series of questions that I can ask, but I want to supplement them to the extent possible with questions. So I'm giving you fair warning that those of you listening in, please put your questions into the stage chat and we'll pick up on them in a few minutes. So let's turn to our first question, which is, how can a pharma company correctly engage with a patient body, and how would they go about contacting them and working with them? So Christine, I know you've talked a little bit about this earlier today. Do you want to talk about how Janssen does this?
Sure. So, I always preface this by saying we all work in a highly regulated industry, whether you are in a company or an advocacy position. And so, of course, it's important to make sure that we're respecting the boundaries of both organizations and understanding not only the policy of our own organization, but the policies of how advocacy organizations work, because they also have policies and procedures around how they interact with pharma. So that's, kind of the precursor to then being able to engage, which is reaching out and finding groups. For us, of course, we're focused in expanded access, so we're looking to work with groups that have similar focus or have a focus in expanded access, such as the Isaac Foundation and other groups. And so generally, we're looking to begin an engagement that allows us to have bi-directional dialogue. And so sharing information that we have, such as strategies around pre-approval access, which is something we started to do a few years ago, making sure we're getting patient input, but also that really important piece of co-creation with patient and patient representatives. So making sure if we're making a tool, that it's a tool that patients want to see. It's not a recreation of the wheel. It's not something we think is a fabulous idea, but will fall flat. So vetting and validating things that people need and not things we think they need. And then kind of the rest is kind of organic from there, I think, if you do it that way.
Excellent. Naomi, do you want to tell us how you make things organic?
I just want to echo Christine's comments there. I totally agree. But yeah, from my perspective, I think the patient is the biggest stakeholder. That's why we're all here today. I think it's really important just to understand the patient community, the patient group. What is their disease? What is their condition? What's the history? Do they have approved medicines in that space? Do they have clinical trials in that space? Do they have failed clinical trials in that space? Because obviously, like you've heard, it's devastating. I've looked after many families that have been through that and are looking for early access, and that's literally the only last hope. They've exhausted all other options. Some families might be waiting for 10 years or more. So just to think about that and getting close to the patient, engage with them at conferences if you can, go there early. Face-to-face meeting is great. Genuine, listen and learn from them. There's no better person to engage with is the actual patient group. So yeah, I just say early engagement, be as open and transparent as you can.
And Alex, it seems like a foundation to me really enhances the message because you're causing multiple individual voices to resonate more loudly, perhaps. Do you want to sort of explain how that works for Isaac?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I mean, not to just repeat everything that Christine and Naomi just said, but kind of emphasizing that engaging with patient groups kind of from the earliest stage possible. So not just when you start thinking about implementing an EAP, but before that, the earliest stages of clinical trial design. And through that engagement, we work with our patients, like we talk to them every day, evening, weekend, whenever they have time to connect. And so there's no better way to understand patients, the disease itself, and the daily burden of living with these diseases than by connecting with patient groups who are able to kind of synthesize all of those voices. And I think that would, provide a greater sense of purpose and development and real insight into the reality of the disease, and then, an ability to set realistic expectations of what success might look like. And then, after you've made that early engagement, continuing that engagement and that transparent communication as program planning evolves. So not just, a one-time meeting where you can check a patient engagement tick box, but kind of ongoing. And like Christine was saying, like a two-way path of sharing information back and forth and making sure that's communicated to your respective organization or your patient base. And, from Christine and Lisa's talk earlier this afternoon, we know that really robust programs like this that are ethical and engage patients are possible. So we know it can happen because it is happening.
Yes, we've got a very good sense of that for the last few days. I guess I would also like to ask maybe a tactical example of each of the three of you can think of an example, because obviously, once you have a patient you've identified or they've connected with you, you can turn on the communications machine. But how do you, what puzzles me, how do you reach patients who are maybe just coming to grips with a diagnosis or a condition that the patient has in there? How do you reach out to the initial communication, either through a foundation, or I think it gets at who the key stakeholders are. For example, do you in advance reach out to clinicians who are treating a particular disease area so that you can get patients steered to you in advance that aren't in your network already? How does that initial conversation start? Do you want to start, Naomi?
Yeah, I can do. I think the answer is it depends, which I know is an annoying answer, but I think it's different in each scenario. So yes, you can set up advisory boards and patient committees and reach out to patient organisations who can speak on behalf of patient communities, and you can do press releases for early access programs if the company wants to, which is a great compliant way to spread that news and to making sure the patient organisations are informed and they can disseminate that. And then right from the beginning, before you're even thinking about EAP, I think it's really important, like Alex and Christina said, but they can really help with designing of the policy, designing of the program, and even what data collection points you're going to collect with your real world data. So it's as early as possible. And if you know your clinical trial sites and you know that they have patients that aren't going to be eligible for the clinical trials, they're going to have patients for their EAPs. So if you're anticipating those requests and you're engaging with the KOLs and the PIs and you know those sites, and you're also engaging with the patient organisations, you should be able to anticipate better the landscape of what the EAP is going to look like.
Do you want to add on to that, Alex? I mean, how do you first, you're in the rare disease space, how do you first uncover new patients that might be benefited by an EAP?
So in terms of connecting with new patients, and you were referencing, newly diagnosed families that are perhaps struggling to come to terms with the diagnosis, we actually have a policy where we don't personally make first, connection with the family. Like we would never reach out to a newly diagnosed family that, perhaps we saw on Facebook, just, for ethical reasons and to respect that, maybe they aren't ready to make that connection yet. And so how we kind of have come into contact with a lot of the patient communities that we now represent is, we just make sure that we're putting our information out there, on places that we work with a lot of children who are affected by rare diseases. So places that parents are, so Facebook, and I'll make sure our website is updated, on our website at the bottom, if you scroll to the bottom, you can request to connect with another parent or a patient who is affected by the same disease as yourself or your family member. And so that's, and just kind of word of mouth, if parents know each other or patients know each other, they often refer them to us, and then we connect from there. And in terms of, sharing updates about either clinical trials that are coming up or, possible EAPs, we just make sure that we're posting that information publicly online, and we're connecting in with our patients, holding webinars and patient symposiums and education events so that our patients, it's nothing new to them. They hopefully know that this research has already been happening. And I mean, they would know this anyway because they are, they're experts in the disease and the landscape out there. So that's kind of how we handle things. Yeah.
It's this early stage that seems critical to me too, though, because you're really reaching people when they're at their most desperate time, when they don't even know where to turn. So that's what it seems like. It's really important start to the conversation. Christine, how do you facilitate that in terms of being ready to talk to families, once they reach that point?
So for us, and I would say this is, largely for the manufacturer perspective, is, our interactions are not, with, family or patients. It's generally with the treating physicians.
Right.
But to the point of having, wanting to share and needing to share information so that patients and families are familiar about what's going on so they can have conversations with their physicians. That's why, we focus on materials or educational aspects, or making sure that information about our programs is available, on our website. I talked a little bit about, co-creation of materials that we then share with advocacy groups who are really the interface with patients and families. And so again, underscoring that need for collaboration among pharma and advocates and patients to make sure that there's that pass-through of information, because pharma does have limitations on how it can interact with patients and families. So, you want to back up a little bit and look at, what's the root need? The root need is that people need information. How do you do that compliantly, but transparently? And so it's, materials, co-creating those materials, and then making sure you have a mechanism to distribute those materials to the people that most need them.
Right. So you have to anticipate the needs is interesting.
Yeah, I think it's the early and often thing that we keep talking about in the conference.
Yep. And so this kind of relates to the third question that we were going to talk about. And I know I've encountered this because I've mentioned to some of you that I work with the Rutgers Cancer Institute a lot, is how do we address geographic and equitable access for patients and knowledge? Because, if we're located in a major metropolitan area with a teaching hospital, it's one thing, an academic institution. But if you're in a community hospital or a rural setting, how do we cause those patients to be included as well? Alex, do you want to... Canada's a small space with no rural areas. Do you want to tell us how you do it?
Yeah, everything's very compact in Canada. I think you hit the nail on the head. The idea that all patients need to be considered, right, regardless of barriers, whether those are geographical, economic, or just kind of practical and logistical. So by working, if we're able to work with patient groups early on to understand those barriers, I think industry will have a better sense of how to remove them as barriers so that they're no longer, a roadblock to gaining access. And that could be really practical things like, if we're talking with rural spots, like if they do need to travel, is there a fund in place to help with travel or temporary relocation, things like that? Is there a person, a designated person who will help with those logistics? If that's not possible, ideally you'd have the funds in place to make that possible, and you'd have a person to do that. But if you're unable to do that, talk to a patient group. It wasn't for an EAP, but it was for a clinical trial in Naples, Italy for MPS 6 gene therapy. And we kind of developed our own little relocation support program because the research center wasn't able to. And we knew that in advance. So we were able to plan accordingly so that we could help get families there and make sure they had accommodations set up and because it's already, kind of culture shock and overwhelming and stressful as it is. So kind of removing those barriers. And I'm sure Naomi and Christine have a lot to.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Naomi, do you want to go next and explain, I'm sort of wondering too, are there stakeholders or partners that you have to work with to reach some of these communities? Not necessarily you reaching out, but other organizations that are maybe involved in, diversity and inclusion programs in general that may want to include healthcare in their mix.
Well, my advice would be to always get independent ethical advice from someone like the New York University. And as you saw in a previous presentation from Lisa, I think that's the way to go, and that's a great advice because it's independent, and you've got that full committee, you've got clinicians on there, you've got patient advocates on there, and you've got pharma on there that are used to that experience. And it's an impossible task, really. I wouldn't want to be given it, even being from a clinical nurse and having to screen patients and choose patients to go into trials and early access programs. It's a heartbreaking process. And I think all patients should be considered, like Alex said, regardless of your geographical or economic status, and all anonymized and treated fairly and ethically. But I think to be as clear as possible and meet expectations. If you only have a limited amount of drug and you can only give so much, then be clear and be honest. And patients would rather know that and know that they can't get access for a certain reason of data needing to come out or not enough resources or drug than to be ignored and have no response. So I just think it's really important to be clear, to be honest, be transparent, and get independent advice, because it's not an easy task. And stick to that plan once you've made it. With compact and stay true to it.
Yeah, it's a very hard challenge, I think. Christina, I guess I would phrase the question differently to you. It's not just patients who are in, disadvantaged geographic locations or not having access, but it's also, rural clinicians or community hospitals. Does Janssen have programs to reach out to some of these health systems that aren't, major academic health centers?
Well, I think, again, from the expanded access perspective, things we have to work from a reactive space versus the proactive space. But from a health, general health disparity perspective, I would say in order to have, consistency is one of our ethical platforms. And so one of the ways that you help bridge those gaps is to make sure that you're evaluating those requests the same.
Right.
So whether you are running the company or, helping keeping the building clean, your request is going to be received and reviewed in the same exact manner. Or if you are an employee of a company and we get a request, the request is handled the same. It's measured against the same list of criteria. That criteria has already been pre-vetted, with an independent lens from a bioethical framework. And so that's a big way of how you ensure consistency and fairness across the people who are coming to us for help. The health disparity aspect, we talked about this in our prep sessions, and Naomi said it's almost an impossible task. You have to prepare for what you can, you have to address the things that you're able to, but there's inherent disparities in people who are in, like you're saying, rural areas may not have access to a lot of computer information to be able to access websites and these things. And so it's kind of, chicken and egg in a lot of the things, and you may not have the chicken or the egg. And so where do you go? So again, it's this collaboration piece of having to make sure that the key pieces are addressed by the appropriate people. So, we can make medical criteria, but if we don't vet that with a bioethics platform, then it's, maybe not as robust as it could have been just by doing a medical criteria. But for us, that gap is bridged. We try to bridge that gap through consistency and being fair with all of the requests.
Yep. No, that's certainly a good approach. Well, let's turn and see if there's any audience questions. I have a few of my own, but let's just see if we have any. We have one from, Andrew's asking his questions, Alex. That's not good. Did you put him up to it? This is Andrew's question. This type of collaboration between industry and patient advocates is wonderful, and it's easy to see how well these three work together for patients. And the benefits of that collaboration are evident, but it's not always the norm. What are the dangers for EAP programs or for clinical trials of not collaborating with patient groups in this fashion? Anyone want to volunteer for that one first?
I vote Alex.
Yeah, well, she's either going to answer now or when she gets home. We know that. Well, I think the question is a long question, but it comes down to, I think what he's asking, it's not always the norm. He says, what are the dangers for EAP programs or clinical of not collaborating? I guess I'm not exactly sure how he means the question, but do you have patients, for example, who are deemed not to be good candidates for an EAP program, and what are the implications of not collaborating with those patients? Maybe is the meaning of his question.
Well, I mean, from our perspective, anyone who hopefully wants to gain access to any, I mean, ideally there is some sense of criteria for eligibility, and we're able to help kind of communicate that. And it all goes back to communication, like we've been, early planning and communication is kind of, I feel, the summary of what a lot of us have been discussing these last 2 days. And I think, the dangers of not having that communication or collaborating and touching base with patient groups. I mean, there are so many, we could have an entire day about that. But it's, it's not having a good sense of patient needs, or, even for things like if you're deciding on what are the, if you wanted to collect the real world data that we've been talking about all day.
Yeah.
A good sense of like what are kind of the key things that we can be looking at, because realistically you can only collect so much, and you can only expect physicians to collect so much, and so I think that's a key issue and a key benefit of engaging with patients. And then
you're anticipatory, because the next question is exactly what you just answered from Tom Watson. You've already anticipated the question, but it gets at, someone was talking earlier how the EAP is a little bit less focused on research than the clinical trial obviously is, but it seems like maybe we're moving in a direction where evidence could still be gathered in order to gauge efficacy and safety, even if it's not part of the trial. So now Andrew's answering again. But so how do you feel about this real world data, Naomi? Do you want to talk a little bit about from your work? Gathering real world data from, or at least the expectation of how you monitor patients in EAP programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think collecting some form of data should be fundamental to all EAPs now, and especially in rare. I mean, that's my main experience, because the clinical trials are so small and so strict. And if you're giving access to investigational medicine, why not at least take a baseline and a few data points that you can compare? I mean, even if it's only 3 or 4 points. Obviously, physicians aren't reimbursed, and that is hard. I've been a clinical trials nurse, inputting all the data. It takes a lot of time. But if it's along the same lines of the standard of care, or a questionnaire that is reliable and meaningful to the patient groups, and not ones that aren't disease specific, because they aren't always very clear and very meaningful at all. But again, what we said before, if you bring the patient groups to the table, and before you decide what real world data you collect, you speak to the patients that are actually living with that condition every day, you can find out what's meaningful to them. And it probably isn't a 6-minute walk test or 3-minute stair climb, but if it's a meaningful quality of life measure that you can collect, and maybe a function measure, and something that's taken, even their blood values at a normal clinic appointment, and you can actually see, what is happening with this investigational medicine in this specific patient in this disease. Because quite frankly, if we don't collect that, it's lost. And this is so precious, this data, and it really can inform the future generations of patients. So I feel very, very passionately about, we must collect the data, and we must make sure that it's utilised.
Yeah. You made me think, though, too, to what extent does it help you? Because obviously the EAP program is an ongoing program. So if you have patients that are already in it and have either positive or negative experiences in terms of their, response, does that help you guide the EAP program itself, not just the, the drug trial, but the, what types of patients might do well with this therapy? Does any of the data sort of cause you to rethink who might be good candidates for an EAP?
It can definitely, and obviously if you're going then to regulatory bodies and it's helping with reimbursement, you can see exactly how it's behaving outside of the strict criteria of clinical trials.
Yeah.
I think.
Go ahead, Christine.
I'm sorry. No, I was just going to say, I think, the comments that Alex and Naomi have made, kind of underscore the first part of your question, which was, or Andrew's question, excuse me, of what's the danger of not engaging, with patients when we're looking at programs. And I think, the ultimate danger is that you're not ultimately serving your key stakeholder, which is your patient.
Right.
If you don't have the voice of the patient included in what you're doing. And again, I think, coming back to expectation management, not all feedback or input can be integrated, but it's the ability to have that discussion around, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do, and why. I generally use the analogy of we're all inside of us 2-year-olds that don't want to hear no. But if we hear no, we just want to know why. So what's the next one? No, why? I just tell me why. And that's, you may not like the answer, but you have an answer and you're closing a loop, which is, to me, I know for me, very important. And most people I've worked with, just want to have closure.
Yeah, and if you say no, I'm going to go ask Dad whether I can do it or not, too.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. I completely agree. I do think no, and the rationale behind that, and a transparent explanation is better than being ignored and not being told anything. And when you're engaging with these patient groups, like Christine's just alluded to, you can't always take everything on board. It's not a perfect world. We all know that. But just to be acknowledged and empowered as a patient group and be listened to, active listening, that you actually are telling them what you're hearing and feeding that back, and actually consistent feedback to say, hey, we took on board what you said for this. This is going to be input in our policy, this is going to be put in our protocol, and we're going to collect these endpoints because of this fruitful conversation. That's really engaging and empowering for patients. Amazing. There might be some things that they don't agree with or they can't do. I think educational materials as well is really important. And if pharma companies can do that, like Janssen, you're leading the way, because patients are looking for help and support and education all the time. And they're often lost until they can find the right organizations to support them.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And it also forces you to confirm you heard them correctly, too, because there may be instances where you sort of responded and hadn't quite completely understood what they were asking or what they were facing, what their challenge was. So it really is informative.
And revisiting that dialogue. Go ahead, Naomi, sorry.
No, I was going to say, and like Alex said, it's not a tick box. We've engaged with the patient this year, and that's the tick done. Because it's two-way, mutually benefiting.
I think Richard Klein's sort of reinforcing the message. He's saying that the level of transparency is important too, so that people can understand not just what you're saying, but perhaps why and what the rationale was.
100%.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Sorry, that goes back to what we were saying, like even if the answer is no, or there's, maybe there's no EAP right now, or it's something that we'll revisit, that's fine. Like, it's also terrible. Patients are used to hearing disappointing news, but I think that's better. They would rather have that information than have this sense of false hope or the end. So I think, and also just communicating things in a very patient-centric way that is, designed for patients and their families. And that's something that Janssen's incredible at. And that's what patient groups can help disseminate.
Yeah, I think that's key. And also they're not being strung along with no answer either. They're not being, sort of living in purgatory, which could be even worse. So one last question that I'll ask, to what extent do the three of you work closely with patient foundations? I know obviously Alex does, but I've worked with a lot of patient foundations like the Global Liver Institute and big ones like Faster Cures and the Melanoma Research Alliance. There's the Multiple Myeloma Foundation. I know there's a lot of different ones. To what extent do you find it useful to work with them in advance of engaging patients, just making the foundation more aware of the kinds of programs you're offering, and they can steer people to you? Is that an active part of your efforts, or who wants to go first on that one?
So I'll just give a brief. I mean, it's similar to what I mentioned earlier, which is, we look for, when we're developing expanded access strategies, we look to share those with therapeutically specific advocacy groups, or generally advocacy groups, not so much foundations, unless there's an advocacy component, attached to it, because we want that real world look of what we're planning, and is this generally something you would be thinking that would be helpful to your patient population? Or you never underestimate the effect of a question. It's a different example, but I recently had a safety kind of an open house event with some patients and patient advocates, and I love creating materials. I love working with patients to do those. And there was a component of this piece that we were working on, and this one patient, I said, how does this frame to you? And she said, "This stinks." And I said, "Thank you. That's great. How do we make it?" And she said it very kindly, but we were joking around. But you really, like, if you don't ask, you don't get, right? So you have to ask a question. You have to be open to the answer. But in any case, I'm getting away from your question a bit. But it's that kind of question. Does this work for you? If it doesn't, why? Okay, we'll bring that back and take a look at it. So it's a little different from my perspectives, and of course the very close patient interaction that Alex would have, or the program interactions, that Naomi has in her current role, but certainly she can speak to her past roles.
Okay, well, that's great. So I'll tell you what we're going to do now. Everyone's going to give a 1-minute take-home message for people that are already at home.
Jeff, Alex, sorry, how long have we got left? Because I had a question.
You have another question? We have, technically, we have 6 minutes left.
Okay. I just remember Helen from BMS yesterday, she brought up 2 really good points, and I just wanted to quickly bring that to Alex and Christine and I's attention so we could address it. Do sponsors ever provide patient-facing overviews for treatment of EAPs to patients and healthcare professionals? Does it need to go through ethics? And do you get feedback from healthcare professionals and the services that you provide? I just thought that's a really important question, and that I think that the sponsors that do that work well with patient organisations, and to get that perspective of what the disease area is, their challenges, but also what EAP is, because I find that really rewarding when I come to a patient group who haven't worked in EAP before or has an early access program in their condition, and it's challenging to navigate the landscape and the terminology. And I've been here for years now, and I still get confused with some of the regulations. And as you heard from Christine earlier, that we've done some regulatory work in parallel together, which was really rewarding. But I do think it's really important to have that documentation available, not just for the patient but the healthcare professional as well, because some healthcare professionals that are used to clinical trials aren't used to working in EAP. So it's good to have some materials, and we're actually working on a video right now to share with healthcare professionals, because I think no one wants to read anything anymore, do they? Just want to watch a video.
No. That's right. That's true. Put it on YouTube.
Christine, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else to that, to Helen, because I thought they were 2 interesting and important questions, especially from a sponsor perspective.
I think you've covered it beautifully. I think, from our perspective, it's again, the development of the resources so that people have in hand things to support their discussions with physicians and their families, and vice versa, having things available to physicians that can leverage it. To your point, physicians are not taught expanded access. And there's merits in doing that, but then you're in a niche area where it's on a need to know basis. And so you could go through all the expanded access teachings and not use it for 2 years and then have to start over. But to your point, if you're making a video, there's other resources that are becoming available that allow physicians to utilize that pathway when they need it. And so I think from the streamlining efforts that have been made in the pathways, resources that myself and other industry colleagues have made available to patients and families, I mean, I think that's education never hurts anything, certainly not in this area.
Yeah, definitely check out your website.
Everybody, yeah, and all of the companies, I think, are doing a great job in having information available and making people more readily understand that this is an option that may be available to them, and it's worth looking into if you're in that need. But Alex, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I think to just touch on that subject, one thing that an organization like ours could do is, rather than just send these overviews to patients or to healthcare providers and let them sort it out, we could help facilitate either, a webinar or a roundtable discussion, something like that, where you can bring all the different stakeholders to the table. So that's, government, industry, patients can be there, healthcare providers can be there, and that way you can kind of work out, where are the roadblocks or where are people not understanding, and then how can we improve our materials to just be transparent and digestible for those different audiences.
Brilliant.
Excellent. Thanks for bringing that up too, Naomi. That was really good to bring that in. So I'm going to give Alex and Naomi a take-home message, and Christine's going to actually have her own take-home. She's the chair of TAE too. So why don't the two of you go first? Alex, do you want to just give us kind of your parting thoughts for the audience?
Sure. I mean, I suppose it would be that, there's no group who better understands the realities of a given disease and patients. And there's no group more invested in the success of a given drug than patients. And they're a resource. They're not a burden. They want to help. And they want to be able to share their knowledge. And so I just think, engaging with patients and patient groups as early and consistently as possible is path to success, I think.
Sounds good. Naomi?
Yeah. Oh, well, I echo what Alex and Christine said. But I think the patient is the most important stakeholder. I do think consistency with communication is key, and transparency. So sorry, I got to say those words again. But that you are mutually benefiting relationships. So be clear, be open, be honest, and get to know your patient community.
I think that's great. So thank you all three for being on the panel, you terrific panelists. I would add one final point, which is passion and enthusiasm, which all of you bring to it. And you know, that makes a huge difference too. It comes across to patients, I think. So that's important.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you all.
That was a real pleasure. Thank you, guys.